Kate Milafalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book. And before I get into what the book is, make sure that you are subscribed to everybody you want to be subscribed to. I've heard a lot of complaints from people that their subscriptions are sort of melting into thin air. Double check. And I would appreciate it if you're watching this. If you would subscribe, I would really appreciate that. I get a lot of people who watch and who never subscribe. It breaks my little heart. Okay, so it's our Saturday book. And this book, before I even introduce it, before I even get into it, a gigantic caveat. We're going to be talking a lot about philosophical beliefs, religious heritage. None of this is coming from a place of malice or anything like that. This is simply the real history of how certain religions evolved that isn't all that well known. But having read quite a bit about this from other sources, this book does a good job of confirming the things that I've read and consolidating it. I find it absolutely fascinating, and I hope that if it challenges your concepts of a religion or God or whatever belief system you have, that you will stay open-minded and just bear with us through it and listen, and then, go forward and make up your own mind. I'm not trying to proselytize about anything. And I almost didn't do this book because of the title, because I don't affiliate with any particular system of belief. And I was concerned about this book that it would be one-sided. And it's not at all what I thought it would be. So, having said that, our book this week is Jesus and the Lost Goddess, the Secret Teachings of the Original Christians. Oh, by Timothy Freak, I think his name is. Freak, and Peter Gandy. It is a really interesting book. And as I said, it may challenge some closely held beliefs, but when your beliefs are strong enough, a little challenge shouldn't shake your foundations. And if you are on a journey of philosophical exploration, I believe this book will be very useful for you. I found it fascinating. And I had to really work to understand what I was talking about. So I have simplified it as much as possible. So we'll see how it goes. And what I wrote down here when I first started taking notes is this book will challenge you, and I hope you stay open to the possibilities. These are ideas I'm presenting, not advocating, not an attack. This is an exploration. Now, this book was written in 2001, so it's been around a while, but it's talking about things that have been around for multiple millennia, so we won't get too worried about that. Chapter 1, let's just get right into it. Chapter 1, the Gospel of Gnosis. Now, Gnosis, as you probably all know, but I feel an obligation to try to make sure that everything is clear just for everybody. If you're new to this, Gnosis is spelled Gnosis, and the G is silent. So the Gospel of Gnosis, and here's a little quote. This is from the Gospel of Thomas, and you may ask yourself, I don't remember that gospel. Well, there's quite a lot of scriptural material, written material about the early Christians that didn't make it into the Bible, and these are archaeological facts. So here's what the Gospel of Thomas says. And this is a quote. I will reveal to you what no eye can see, what no ear can hear, what no hand can touch, what cannot be conceived by the human mind. And this is attributed to Jesus. So in the book, They begin by saying that life is a mystery, and we tend to desensitize ourselves to mysteries. It can all be overwhelming. It's okay. So, as I said, this is not an attack on anybody. So, I'm going to make some pretty definitive sounding statements. And this is the conclusion of the authors that I am repeating for you. It's a lie that we know who we are, and we're reminded by moments in life that there is more. We're asked to face the mystery. So this book is about a group of people roughly 2,000 years before us and before that, who did plumb the depths, who faced it fearlessly. They were revolutionary free thinkers. Even in their time, they were considered, out there. They were actually creative visionaries. And they encoded their discoveries in innovative ways to make them available to as many people as possible, keeping in mind that we're talking about roughly pre-literate times. For most people, pre-literate times, and definitely pre-literate area or very low literacy. And they wanted to make the messages that they had discovered from their own exploration and study, they wanted to make them available to as many people as possible and as understandable as possible. So they encoded these discoveries in innovative ways. They were the explorers of consciousness, and they studied the philosophy of Gnosis. And Gnosis, by definition, is the experiential knowledge of truth. If you achieve Gnosis, then you know the truth of the purpose of life and who you are. They call themselves Christians, but that title doesn't mean anything today that it meant for them. And these were the original Christians. They inadvertently were radical. They didn't go out of their way to be radical, but their ideas, they were individualists. Their beliefs became the most authoritarian religion in history over time, but it didn't start out that way. What it became, they called an initiation, they called an imitation church. It was adapted and adopted by the Roman Empire. And these original Christians were violently suppressed by the Romans. Their scriptures were burned, their memory was erased, their communities were leveled to the ground. And what became known as the Roman Church created its own false narrative that dismissed the originals as a minor cult of obscure heretics. And the Roman Empire, with this new belief system that they subsumed, they distorted what was, stick with me here, what was a myth, a fable of a Jesus the Christ. So for the original Christians, Jesus was a myth. And the story of his life was full of symbolism, and it was meant to introduce a spiritual path. The outer mysteries is what it was called for the beginner masses, the people who had no concept of what they were talking about. They told this story. And the story was not the story of the like the Christian church of the 300s. This is earlier than that. And the story that they told was different, and it was symbolic. And I thought a lot about this while I was reading it. And the closest example that I could think of that made it make sense for me was Aesop's fables. So fables, myth, allegory, parables, these are stories that we tell ourselves that have a superficial story to grab our attention, but an underlying message. And most of the characters and the events that happen are symbolic in a way that is recognized by the time and the culture. Even when we don't realize we're recognizing it. Now, for example, I have not seen these movies, but when I was a kid, I read the comic books. So I'm familiar, basically with the Marvel movies. And they're full of archetypes. They're full of characters that are larger than life, that symbolize more than what they appear to be on the surface, and behaviors between, interactions between, things that they do are symbolic of something greater, concepts greater. And this is exactly what happened with the original Christian myths that they told to help their initiates, people who wanted to begin this journey of philosophical exploration. And it was the entree were these stories. So as a child would read Aesop's fables and see the fox trying to get the grapes, like that story, they would read it on one level. And they would be absorbing the symbology without really understanding that's what was happening. But the adult reading the story to them would recognize the message behind the whole thing. So let's just keep going. There were outer mysteries for the people who were uninitiated. It's like their introduction to the belief system. And then there were the inner mysteries, which were the really serious secret teachings that were given to some successors of the masters, passed on to the masters. And this story was not just about a death and a resurrection. It was about far more, but it's hardly heard, if at all, today, hardly talked about. And it includes the story of a goddess figure, which a lot of Christians would recoil from. But stick with me here. The original Christians believed in a divine masculine and feminine energy, but it wasn't a male god and a female goddess. This was the source, the divine source, and it had no gender, but it had, I guess, the closest I could come to explaining it would be like positive and negative energies, and they worked together. They attracted and formed a whole. Think yin and yang. So the divine feminine had a name, Sophia, which in Greek meant wisdom. They regarded her as a wise goddess. Paul, who, not always the best of people, actually wrote quite a bit about her, and his writings were changed and distorted, some of them. So it's important to keep that in mind. So she was the one that is remembered in the modern Christian communion ritual. We'll get to that. So it was acknowledged the bread and wine were symbolic only. They did not believe in what now is called transubstantiation in the Catholic Church, which is the priest does his thing and suddenly this bread and wine becomes actual body and blood. They didn't originally believe that at all. It was actually a bit of a ritual for initiates, and it was symbolic, and it was called a love feast because it was the joining of the feminine and the masculine elements. But the patriarchal Roman Church eradicated the goddess, the Christian goddess, denying both genders the opportunity to connect with the female aspect of the divine. Spirituality became a battleground in the gender wars. The earliest Christians, this is before the Romans got their hands on it, they spoke of a partnership spirituality, genderless, uh, because the genders valued each other equally and were an expression of the divine. They saw the division of the sexes a duality that actually, when made one, was the union of gnosis. So this is what we're talking about here is not physical beings, and it's not stories about what once was or still is or still are physical beings. What we're talking about is symbolic and certain energies joining together, and it becomes a little bit more subtle. We'll get to that eventually. Let's keep moving on. So the whole thing is symbolic of a union of two that become one, and it's about how can I best describe it? It's about achieving a wholeness when you reach the point that you know that you that you're enlightened, that you have achieved consciousness, and that you know that we are the divine. We're all a part of the same thing. So Jesus must be seen as the culmination of a cycle of Christian myths. Now, this is really hard to wrap your head around, and we'll still continue to say, Jesus said, quote this like this is a real person. And I think it's important in the context of this book to remember that Jesus said these things in these stories. Was there a real Jesus? I don't know. The fox said a lot of things about the grapes, but was there a fox that talked? No. And it's that same level. So primordial mother-father culminates in basically what's called a union or a marriage of Jesus and Sophia, the light, the wisdom, the male, the female. So these are allegories. These are stories that reveal a hidden meaning. That's all. They are stories of spiritual initiation. They're symbolic. And we're going to get into that a little bit later on in the book. And it's really interesting to reread the New Testament, especially, although it goes all the way back into early pagan beliefs and early Jewish beliefs. But it's kind of fun to read these stories with a completely different point of view. It's really interesting. They encode a profound philosophy. They were believed to have the power to transform an initiate from a Christian to a Christ. Now that's going to shake a lot of people up. I think there's a lot of fundamentalists who would find that offensive, but that was the goal. Christ was a symbol of the anointed one. In the Bible, he called himself, I am the anointed one. And what that was somebody, well, not body, it was enlightenment. And it's a lifelong process of transformation into a moral and spiritual image of Jesus. The good news is that this transformation of consciousness is possible. We can achieve it. All of us can achieve gnosis or knowledge. It's a personal, mystical evolution to achieve the divine, to find the divine within. And the other phrase that's often used in all of these old sources is the good news. That is the good news. It's our birthright. It's absolute freedom. It's not a set of rules. It's not commandments. It's not a set of rules. It's discovering our own essential nature, which is that we are immortal. We often say we're not our bodies, we're our souls. Well, this is a little bit more nuanced, but it's the same basic idea. There's no avoiding physical death, but we have to realize our true identity is that we are eternal, and it puts all of the problems of the physical world into a certain perspective. So this book is an exploration of these beliefs. I found it really interesting. I hope you will too. It's a alternative to the traditional view of the original Christians and their beliefs. It's not what we're usually led to believe, not what we're told to think about them. So this knowledge is not widely known because the Roman Church spent, well, the Roman Catholic Church spent about 6 centuries destroying the evidence. So it is true that Christians were persecuted. That's true. But they were often persecuted because they were the wrong kind of Christian. They were in possession of the ideas of this gnosis, and it challenged the authoritarian view of the Roman Church. And it wasn't acceptable to what became the established Christian belief system. However, some knowledge was hidden or occulted. Occulted means hidden, it doesn't mean evil. It was hidden to preserve it because they were going around, destroying communities, leveling them to the ground and killing them all and burning their sacred scriptures, their texts that had this knowledge, forbidding them to practice their rituals that were symbolic of these philosophies and intended to just remind people in a symbolic way of the philosophy, not reenacting a real life person. But as I said, this is known to be true because archaeology has rediscovered things that it seems almost miraculous that they were found. For example, Nag Hammadi in Egypt, where they found these scriptures of the Essenes, the Gnostic Gospels, in a cave. Some of the knowledge that was passed down, even the stuff that wasn't intentionally distorted, suffered the alteration of bad translations, misunderstandings, often intentional, but not always. When the original story is pieced together correctly, it reveals a profound mystical philosophy, and it echoes earlier philosophies, which is so interesting. So the book points out that just because our ancestors lived a long time ago in different conditions, they weren't idiots. They weren't stupid. And we owe them the respect that they have long been denied. They've long been misunderstood. Scholars have equated gnosis with intellect, that kind of knowing, but it's not. It's a state of being, and it requires a grasp of experiential mysticism that was forbidden to people. So the authors make a point of saying that they're not affiliated with any religion. They don't belong to any organization, any cult. They're not pushing any one frame of modern belief. They're telling us the history, the philosophical history of the past. They had the goal of making this book accessible to everybody. Therefore, there are extensive notes in the back of this book. It's daunting when you see a book with such small writing, and you're taking notes on it. It's like, oh my God. But this much of it is notes, places that you can go and verify this information. So this book is a revelation, and it doesn't talk about a dead spiritual tradition. It's quite relevant to today. So chapter 2 is the original Christians. And let's see what the quote is. I'm trying to remember to keep my glasses off because I know they shine. They reflect the light, and it's very annoying, and I apologize. What page am I looking for here? Probably help if I put them on. Okay, this is chapter 2, the original Christians, and the quote is, "Much that is written in pagan books is found also in the books of God's church. What they share in common are the words which spring from the heart, the law that is inscribed in the heart." And then also, so this is from a Hindu guru. "Do you come to effect our restoration? I am one of the ancient order of Therapeutae. The truths preached by us have been given out by Christians as taught by Jesus. But for the matter of that, there was no personality by the name of Jesus ever born. And this is very, very old from a Hindu scholar. At the end of the 1800s, this is the Hindu guru Vivekananda, and he was a disciple of Ramakrishna, who was a mystic. He introduced Vedanta, which is Hindu philosophy, and yoga, which is the spiritual practices that go with it, to the Western world. He had an interfaith awareness, and he helped elevate Hinduism to the status of a major religion, but it felt very foreign to Western people, kind of mired in Roman Christianity. But he had a dream that I just read to you to share this understanding. He presented a revolutionary new vision of the origins of Christianity. So the authors wrote this book after many years of research and the uncovering of an awful lot of actual physical in your hand evidence. It demanded that they think the unthinkable. I mean, bit of a challenge to them too. The evidence demanded we think the unthinkable. Christianity was not the cult of a first century Messiah. It was a Jewish adaptation of the ancient pagan mystery religion. We could find no evidence that there had ever been an historical Jesus because the gospel story was a Jewish reworking of ancient pagan myths of a dying and resurrecting Son of God. We even ventured in informed guesses to who may have authored the original Jesus myth, and they think it was a sect of mystical Jews called the Therapeutae. And really, this all goes back even farther to the Osiris story of the Egyptians and farther back yet. Very interesting. Okay. So then they hear of this guru's dream a century, the one I read to you, a century before their research ever happened. This guy had uncovered a lot of these things. Carl Jung believed it was possible to reconstruct all of history by connecting to the collective unconscious. And he would explain all of this by, well, of course, it's all out there in the collective unconscious. So this book is geared towards uncovering the meaning of Christianity, not to upset anybody, not to challenge people, other than to challenge everyone to think. Just stop and think. So at first, it was a review of the origins that were discussed in the book, and the Jesus stories, the Jesus mysteries. They want to get people to understand. They found that the best way is to open people up to a rival picture of how the Christianity story developed. There really is a completely different story. Their first suggestion is to listen to the losers of the 3rd and 4th century civil war between the Roman Church and anyone who disagreed with it. Anybody that challenged the authority of the Roman Church was called a heretic, and they went to great lengths to silence them. And we all know the story of the martyrs. We've seen St. Lucy with her eyeballs on a platter. A lot of those people that are considered holy martyrs of the Christian church were actually defying the Roman Empire's version that swayed away from Gnosticism and the original philosophies of the Gnostics of the past. So the accepted history has been written by the winners of this battle. But the authors have found that through their research that the account of the origin and the meaning of Christianity is far closer to the story of the dissidents, the losers of this battle that was fought. So we could characterize this battle, very simplified, as the Gnostics versus the literalists. So most people identify with some religious label, and they want to use classifications that in the book that reflect the spiritual understanding of larger concepts, not any one religious tradition. They're not here to undermine anybody's religious tradition. They're here to put forward these stories that have been hidden and ignored and try to explain them in terms we can understand. So there were two opposing poles of religious movements, the Gnostics, Gnosticism, and the literalist Christians. And it all started out as Christianity. The Gnostics were the first. The Roman Empire stepped in between and created the literalists. Gnostics can exist in most religious traditions. That's really important to remember. There are Jewish Gnostics, there are pagan Gnostics, there are Islamic Gnostics, and they have more in common with each other than they do literalists from their own traditions. So if you were to say that you were a Gnostic Christian, you would have more in common with a Gnostic Jew or a Gnostic pagan than you would have with a modern day Christian. Literalists from different traditions don't get along with other literalists because they believe their version is literally verbatim the truth and everybody else is wrong. Gnostics from all religions may use different vocabularies to articulate what they believe, but it's a common understanding underneath. So this is often called a perennial philosophy. So remember that term. It means the shared underlying belief of Gnostic belief systems. Gnostics may disagree on some points, but overall they share the same essential perspective. All Gnostics are parts of one evolving tradition, no matter their religion, no matter their race, no matter their culture. They have the same goal, gnosis, the knowledge of truth. And I am kind of using the present tense because they still exist, but they exist from way back. In many languages and religious traditions, those who seek and achieve knowledge and enlightenment are called knowers in a variety of different languages and vocabulary, but that's what Gnostics are. They regard the stories and the teachings of their tradition as signposts to the mystical experience of the ineffable mystery. We'll explain, make that a little more clear. Liberalists believe that their scripture, and only theirs, are actually the words of God, literally the words of God. And they consider stories and myths intended to be allegorical. They consider them historical, literal truth. Gnostics are concerned with the inner essence and, finding knowledge of and recognizing the divine within. Literalists are much more concerned with outward manifestations, rituals, sacrifices, symbols, that kind of thing. The Gnostics are on a personal journey of spiritual transformation, and literalists, they see themselves fulfilling a divinely ordained obligation to practice religious customs as part of their identity and to follow sets of rules. Literalists believe they have a unique claim on the truth. Their dogma defines their membership. They're prepared to force their opinions on others, and they silence dissent. They justify this because they feel that they are fulfilling God's will. The Gnostics are more independent thought, free spirits. They question presuppositions of their culture. They follow the heart, not the herd. They're consumed by a private quest for enlightenment. They're not busy recruiting adherents to their beliefs because it's a personal, individual journey. Gnostics free themselves from limitations and they experience oneness. That's their goal. And they're okay with adopting the wisdom of other traditions. As we said, Gnostics from a variety of different belief systems have a lot in common with each other. Terminology may be different, symbols might be different, but the concepts underlying them are the same. Literalists use religion to create their identity. They define themselves in opposition to other people and other belief systems, and this leads to disputes. Literalists from different traditions fight wars with each other, and each has God on their side. They're enemies. They're enemies to the Gnostics, too, from their own tradition. The Gnostics don't consider people enemies, but the literalists do. Now, this is not personal opinion. This has been stated over and over in all kinds of writing from a variety of different cultures and in the philosophical documents and scriptures from all over the world. And it's really interesting. The book does present examples, and I have picked my way through and tried to refer to the ones that are the clearest. But there are whole entire paragraphs naming all the different philosophers from around the world who said this or who said that in a different language, a different time, a different culture. And you can read the book to get that. We're looking for the larger concepts. So the authors are careful to admit that they're changing terminology may affront classicists, and it might bother Christian scholars, but they had to use accurate words, and they're basing their choice of vocabulary on the original meaning of the words from the original belief systems and the earliest writings. Christianity admits that it gets elements from Judaism, but it also is heavily influenced by paganism and wouldn't want to admit that. But it's a product of neither. It's a reaction against both. Heavily influenced, yes, but it's kind of a rejection against both. So let's talk about the Therapeutae and the Essenes. Now, if you're interested in the Essenes, there's a book I covered a long time ago by Dolores Cannon called Jesus and the Essenes, and it's really, really interesting. She does I guess, like a remote viewing. She goes back in time, past life regression with a client of hers to look at the community of the Essenes, and it's just really interesting. The Gnostic tradition flourished in the Mediterranean area, and it included many beliefs that had a common mystical philosophy. They shared the abhorrence of literalist limitations. Strictly speaking, there's really no such thing as original Christians. Instead, there's a stream of Gnostics from many cultures and different life experiences, all with a unique, shared, perennial philosophy. They share a common understanding of certain core principles. So, for example, the Jewish Gnostic school, they synthesized Jewish and earlier pagan myth, and they created new myths. And this was the beginning of Christianity. They might be called the proto-Christians. And who was that? Well, that was the Therapeutae and the Essenes. They're described by Philo, who was a Jewish Gnostic from the 4th century BCE. So 400 years, well, more like roughly 300 years. 400 plus years before ostensibly the birth of Christ, even though according to this belief system or this philosophy, that's a story, but using that dating system, so hundreds of years before this, Philo called the Therapeutae and the Essenes two parts of a single philosophy. And they think he was probably a Therapeutae. They emerged from the cosmopolitan pagan cultures that were synthesizing with each other for centuries. So all around the Mediterranean, there are there was an enormous varied group of cultures and belief systems. Lots of big cities, they're not big maybe by New York City standards, but big for the time, and sophisticated. The people were not dumb because it was a long time ago. They just had a little less technology, perhaps, but they spent a lot of time in thought. And Philo described them as the people around the Mediterranean as frogs around a small pond, Mediterranean being the pond. They were in close contact. They heard each other. Decades later, Alexander the Great transformed the ancient world into one big culture, Greek, with an international language being Greek. And the pagan, Jewish, Christian Gnostics shared their ideas with each other in Greek. And there was an explosion of what they call creative eclecticism. So there was a lot of big thoughts being shared. Gnosticism flourished. By the 1st century BCE, there was a huge number of Jews in Judea and in the larger Mediterranean that were integrated into pagan society. The delineation wasn't quite as clear as we might suspect. And of course, it depended on how you practiced your Jewish faith. Were you what we would today call totally Orthodox, traditionalist, or were you a Jewish Gnostic? And that would affect your particular belief system. So there were a lot of Jewish Gnostics. They were cosmopolitans, which means in Greek, citizens of the cosmos, and they meant that. Philo was part of an international fellowship of Greek philosophers. Who knew? He writes of being part of an international fellowship of Gnostic philosophers who, although comparatively few in number, keep alive the covered spark of wisdom secretly throughout the cities of the world. And secretly because they're always sort of swimming upstream against the tide of prevailing authoritarian religions around everywhere. The Jewish Gnostics claimed to have secret mystical teachings from Moses. These were very similar to pagan Gnostic beliefs, and many have claimed that the pagans got them from Moses too. The Jewish Gnostics embraced pagan Gnosticism, philosophy, and myth, and they synthesized it with their own. Synthesized is a word that gets thrown around a lot here in this book, and what they're talking about is combining underlying beliefs, the perennial philosophy. So this fusion of Jewish and pagan Gnosticism evolved into what became the Therapeutae and the Essenes, and they followed Moses if they were of the Jewish Gnostic belief, and they followed Pythagoras if they were of the pagan, and they had communities all over the Mediterranean. Josephus, for example, was Jewish, and he said that the Essenes followed Pythagoras. Now, the Essenes are that community that ostensibly, maybe, Jesus and John the Baptist affiliated with. Philo said that Therapeutae were followers of Pythagoras who followed a contemplative life and had wisdom from Greece. And some Jewish Gnostics followed the Cynic school of pagan Greece. They called it the Way, that was later adopted by Christians. Jesus said, I am the way, right? 4th century Christians, literalists, have a historian by the name of Eusebius, and he said that Therapeutae were the first followers of Christ. So they were the accepted form of Gnosticism with a tweak, I guess. But Philo wrote about Therapeutae teaching that were written long before Jesus, long before ostensibly Jesus lived. So Eusebius was wrong, And Jesus did not come first. The ideas came first. And this is 100% verified in our archaeological evidence that these ideas are much older. Therapeutae did, in fact, create the notion, and I wrote in the margins here that I wanted to tell you. Stay with me here. Don't freak out. The Therapeutae and the Essenes did, in fact, create the idea of Jesus. We'll get to that. In those days, myths were profound allegories that encoded mystical teaching because most people couldn't read. Mythological motives were actually philosophical principles. And they used an archetypical vocabulary. They used symbolic characters that people recognized and events that people related to. And eventually we will get to some stories from the Bible, and it's just fascinating to see, oh, okay, I see what they're getting at. I always thought this was kind of a lame story, or what was the motivation with these particular characters? And then when you put it in the context of Gnosticism, it's crystal clear, really interesting. So they were creating new myths that reflected new ways of thinking and reworking the old myths and adding the new ideas. Okay, let me see here. So Philo tells us that the Therapeutae were devoted to philosophizing and interpreting their ancestral scriptures allegorically, for they think that the words of the literal meaning are symbols of a hidden nature which is made plain only by the under meaning. So what is he saying? This guy who lived 400 roughly years before Jesus, he's espousing a lot of the basic beliefs, as we shall see in the New Testament stories. But he's saying that those stories are allegories. They existed long before he did, and he existed long before the stories of the New Testament. Imaginative mythologizing is also what the later Christian Gnostics specialized in. One of their critics condemns them for using allegorical interpretation to freely recompose Jewish scriptures and Greek epic mythology, which is precisely the two sources used to create the myths of Jesus and the goddess. So starting with the Therapeutae and the Essenes, in the 1st century BCE, the body of what became Christian mythology evolved. It has undergone many revisions, and there were different schools of thought that had slightly different myths. I think we can relate to that. So the question is broken down into two parts. How do we get here and where we are today, and how do we get out of it? How do we, the contention, how do we get out of it? And the answer is that Jewish Gnosticism answers are all encoded in allegorical myths of Moses, for example, Genesis, and for another example, Exodus. Those are not historical events, they're symbolic allegories. So it was understood that Genesis was encoded teaching about the descent of the soul into a physical incarnation. And had you been alive at the time that the story was first put together by the early Jewish Gnostics, you would recognize it as a reworking of pagan Gnosticism. And you might, if you were a student, an initiate, you might understand the symbology, the allegorical nature of it. It's not really about a snake in a garden. It's not really about people escaping into the desert. These are tangible characters and events that represent a much larger philosophy. So Exodus, the word means the way out. And it encodes the teachings about the initiate's spiritual path back to God. The way out of what? The way out of being trapped in the physical. The original Christians took these myths and synthesized them with pagan mythology. The pagan Gnostic myths also encoded teachings about the fall and redemption of the soul. They created new myth cycles that explained the descent into an attachment to the material, and then a journey, a return to the central concept of being a spark of the divine, being the divine. So the Christian myths of descent are the same as the Jewish Genesis and the Pythagorean Timaeus by Plato. So there are a lot of examples here about Greek philosophy and other kinds of pagan philosophy, and they're complicated names of characters, convoluted stories, complicated names of the actual writers of the stories. And I really debated, do I go into all the detail about what this play said or what this philosophical essay said? And I decided to try to simplify it so that we're not completely inundated. I felt really inundated, and I tried to make it digestible. So Philo said, okay, this work by Plato and this story of Genesis from the Jewish religion encode the same doctrine. So Genesis and Timaeus are the same. They're the Christian myth of return. They're an allegory that guides us through the stages of initiation leading to gnosis or enlightenment. This is a synthesis of Jewish mythology, the Exodus, and pagan mythology, myth of death and resurrection, of Osiris Dionysus. And they're embellished. And the story of Osiris and of Dionysus, the God-man, these stories became the Jesus story. And the similarities when you read, somewhere I have a long list comparing all these philosophies and the similarities in their mythology, and I can't remember where I read it. It was fascinating. So things like born of a virgin, the Son of God, come to save humanity, born under a star, visited by wise men, gifts of anointing and gold, lost in a period of his life, then 40 days in the desert, miracles. And it just goes on and on and on. The similarities are stunning. And we're talking Egyptian and Zoroastrian, and anyway. So what about the stories of the sources of this story, the Jesus myth? And I'm not calling it a myth to offend anybody, but in the context of this book, that's their argument. So the Exodus allegory it's like a fable. And an allegory is a story with a hidden meaning. It's not meant to be taken literally. Exodus was never meant to be taken literally. So Moses leads the Jewish people out of Egypt across the Red Sea. Then they wander in the desert and they search for the promised land. And Moses dies, and they finally achieve the promised land under the guidance of Joshua, who parts the river Jordan and takes them to their homeland. So then it's important to remember that the name Jesus is Greek for the Hebrew Joshua. Today we associate Joshua with Exodus, and we make a big distinction between him and the Jesus of the Gospels. However, at the time of the original allegory, everybody would have known it was the same name. Because as I said, they had all these different cultures that were interacting with each other and, knew their languages. I mean, maybe not spoken, but were familiar. We all know that Miguel means Michael. Sean is John. Because Christian Jesus is a mythic development from the Exodus Jesus or Joshua. It's important to remember that. How are we doing here? Let me see. Where is a good place to stop? Okay, this is a really long chapter. So I think I'm going to stop right here because this is a good place to stop in the narrative. Just keep in mind the similarity of the name Jesus and Joshua. So this is the end of video number 1. And we will continue here in the same chapter, but not even halfway through it, I don't think. So I hope that you're finding this interesting. I found this fascinating, but I'm kind of I love archaeology and history, so it's right up my alley. And any kind of philosophy that challenges the status quo, that's always good too. So I hope that nobody is offended. I hope that this is taken in the spirit of intellectual exploration as is it's intended. If it resonates for you, that's significant. And other than that, I'll just say slángafoil, slánja.